I'm going to stand at the mic because I don't like yelling. There's no yelling and there's no slamming doors in my house. Welcome back. Great Decisions, week 4. Wonderful to see you all. You know what's really cool? We've been averaging something like 140 people each week in here, which is really, really awesome. And you should give yourselves a hand for being engaged, interested, excited by all of these really phenomenal topics. So give yourselves a hand. As per usual, I want to talk to you about some upcoming things. Before I get into my list of things, I don't want to forget that we are about to host either our 4th or 5th, I'm sorry, Andrew, I keep forgetting, our 4th or 5th Pan-African Youth Leader Group. These are 15 to 17-year-olds. These are young activists from all over Africa that we have been hosting every couple months. We have a group coming in March 20th to 28th, and we have another group coming in May, and we are looking for host families. So if you would love to have an extremely energetic, very excited young person in your house who might just change the way you look at not only Africa but the world, you can go to our website, you can pick up one of these flyers on the table here, you can email Andrew at worldoregon.org, and there is no better way to be an ambassador for both Portland, Oregon, and the U.S. than inviting someone into your home and hanging out with them and feeding them and sharing some conversations. So, bam, there's that. Next, Sunday, February 8th, at the Witzel Auditorium at the Art Museum, we are co-sponsoring a film for the International Film Festival, which opened last night. Fantastic series as always. You're looking at probably 97 features and 60 short films from probably 100 different countries. And one of the things they're doing this year is they're partnering with PSU and they're doing a big look at at films from 10 different Spanish-speaking countries. So that's a really, really cool thing. But the film we're co-sponsoring is all about education, and it is by Pascal Plisson, a really fantastic French filmmaker. It's a César, basically the French Oscar, the César winning documentary, which looks at 4 young people from 4 corners of the globe and the unbelievable, arduous journeys that they have to go through every single day to get an education. This includes walking 22 kilometers over the Atlas Mountains, getting on a horse in Patagonia and riding 18 kilometers, being in a wheelchair in the Bay of Bengal and having your 2 brothers push you 4 kilometers to school. And this is not a wheelchair like you would get if you went to Kaiser. This is a wheelchair you get when you are trying to live in India and sometimes the wheels fall off. It's a beautiful film. It is so moving that if you can't make the 8th, it's showing, I believe, again on the 14th. Check their film schedule. But we'd love to see you all on Sunday, 4 p.m. You can get tickets at nwfilm.org. And then in our look at education across the globe, we have invited Young Zhao to come back on February 17th, which is Tuesday, to talk about who's afraid of the big bad dragon, why China has the best and the worst education system in the world. If any of you came to his talk last January, he is one of the nation's top thinkers on education, and he generally comes in the rankings right behind about like Diane Ravitch and some of those other just powerhouse thinkers on educational reform. And he looks at what we are giving up in our quest to test better around the world and what we could actually learn from looking at our own gifts. And if he were not an educational theorist, he would be an incredible stand-up comedian. So that will be 6:30 p.m., February 17th, in the pavilion at the Oregon Historical Society. Don't miss him. We are partnering with our friends at PSU's Hatfield School and Reed College to bring Dr. Bates Gill to town February 25th. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney, and he used to run the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and he's looking at the future of the U.S. rebalance to Asia and what it really means when we sort of recalibrate our GPS and what are we focusing on and what are we not focusing on that we should be looking at. This is old school foreign policy with a capital F and a capital P. So And to get to today's program, I want to introduce Shawn Smallman, who is not only our speaker for today and our wonderful partner in this series. He is Vice Provost for Instruction and Dean of Undergraduate Studies. And, what is your title now?
I'm the Director of International Studies.
There you go. See, you should update your PSU bio. I bet updating the PSU website is one heck of a job. Anyway, Dean of International Studies, and one of the reasons, along with Stephen Frankel, that we're in this phenomenal Cadillac of a room. So give him a hand just for that. Shawn has written quite a bit on Brazil. He has written Fear and Memory in the Brazilian Military and Society, which examined military terror and corruption. He wrote The AIDS Pandemic in Brazil, which was based on research in southern Mexico, Cuba, and Brazil. During his fieldwork, he interviewed drug traffickers, crack addicts, sex workers, transvestites, doctors, and community leaders. Gosh, it sounds like an indie film. More recently, he has co-authored a textbook, An Introduction to International and Global Studies with Professor Kim Brown. And he is a wonderful presence here. And for anyone who has followed the miraculous transformation of Brazil over, the past 6, 8, 10, 15 years, he's going to help us understand what they've done right and perhaps where we might learn a thing or two. So give him a hand, and here is your mic for questions following the program.
Thank you so much. I've been thinking about Brazil, teaching about Brazil, and visiting Brazil for 25 years now, and I'm slightly obsessed with the country. And I think that the subtitle for the talk today is really appropriate because it's Metamorphosis. And there has been such an intense change in Brazil since I first went there to northeastern Brazil, then the most impoverished part of the country, in 1990. And I remember when I was in Brazil in 1992, 1993, the inflation rate was 1,800% a year. And what that meant to me, practically, was that I had to time when I changed money. Because if you changed it on a money and waited to spend it until Friday, it would be worth anywhere from a third to a half of what it was at the start of the week. So it became something of an art. Like you don't want to change the money too early, right? But sometimes you'd wait too long. Like if you went on Thursday, everything at the grocery store would basically be half price. But you wait too long, you go on Friday, they've changed the prices overnight. It was a very different time to be in Brazil. I can remember going into the post office to mail a letter. They had to get out a calculator to figure out how much a stamp would cost that day. And you could be there, standing there waiting for the bus, and you'd be getting out bills out of your wallet. They take bills about that thick, just to pay for bus. And you'd be there going through and like, oh, that bill's a 60th of a cent. I'm just going to toss it. And you could just see like money just kind of being blown down the street. And to go back to Brazil now and to be able to look up at what are the favelas, but now they have what are called favelas chiques, stylish favelas. And you can see in some of them satellite dishes. You can see houses that are made out of concrete bricks. It's just a real transformation. I don't want to exaggerate it too much because Brazil is still deviled by inequality, but there's no question that it's undergone an immense transformation. And I want to talk for just a minute about why we should think about Brazil. And you saw this in the reading for today. Brazil's economy is roughly $2.5 trillion, depending how you measure it. It recently surpassed Britain. Its economy is larger than that of Russia. So it's the 7th largest economy in the world. The country is also about half the area of South America and half the population of South America as well. If you were to look at the state of Sao Paulo, it has almost double the population of Guatemala, which is the largest country in South America. And it feels that way when you're in the city too. I was there a few years ago and I spent 2 hours driving out of the city, and that was not stuck in a traffic jam either. It's absolutely immense. It has the largest armed forces in Latin America. It has, by all kinds of different measures, it's the most important country in South America. And it's now making a really concerted effort to increase its visibility and its influence. So by these measures, Brazil is a key player on the global stage. And Brazilians have long been imbued with a certain sense of greatness, which they call grandeza. But you also read in the reading for this week that line that is very famous, which is, Brazil is the land of the future and always will be. And there's a certain mistrust within Brazil about this rhetoric about national greatness. It was something that was used very much by the military regime back in the 70s and 80s to legitimate itself. And Brazil also has, behind these numbers, some really staggering problems. Its infrastructure is weak. There are significant problems with the education system. Although Brazilians have long argued, some Brazilians have long argued that they don't have the same history of institutionalized racism that existed in the United States, there's still profound racial inequality. There was a study done in 2005 that looked at national income by population group. And if you were to look at Brazilians of European descent, then their average per capita income would be about equivalent with Lithuania, 44th in the world. But then if you look at Brazilians of African descent, their average national income would have been, or income per person would have been about the same as Vietnam, which I think is about the 110th country in the world. So it has this profound legacy of social inequality, which is something that the last two administrations have worked very, very hard to address. And certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been both economic growth, but also economic growth that has really targeted the poor. The poor have done much better relatively than the wealthy over the last decade and a half, which was very, very interesting. And so I think I want to say a few words about the last two presidents to talk about this. I think that probably the most popular leader in contemporary Brazilian history is President Lula and Angela da Silva. He's a very interesting man. He grew up in Pernambuco, one of the poorest states in Brazil. His father, like many Brazilians in that area, went south to find employment, was gone for a very long time. When Lula was 7, his mother decided that it had been long enough and they were going to go find his father. The whole family packed up, piled into the back of an open-air truck, and they drove 13 days to Sao Paulo, pulled up in front of the house, and his father was there with his new family. So there are two families there, and they decided to share the house, which worked for about 4 years. They didn't get along, as you might imagine. And why this matters is that Lula is someone who had a really intense connection with everyday Brazilians. Like a lot of Brazilians, he went by the name Lula, which wasn't his real name. It means squid in Portuguese. I actually don't know how he came to get that name, but he must have liked it because he formally and legally changed his name. Everybody just called him Lula. And he had a very interesting life. He was a union organizer. He was arrested by the armed forces during military rule in the 1970s. And you have to picture, when I was in Brazil in the early 90s, it had only been since 1985 that Brazil had been a democracy. And so I remember doing interviews with people about military history, and I was looking at military corruption and military terror. And people were really hesitant, which kind of made sense because the military had been in and out of power multiple times. So if it had been, several years since the last time the military is in power, do you really want to talk about a sensitive subject? There was this sense that the military could come back. And here you had this person running for president who was a former labor organizer who was famous for wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. He had a beard, and he talked in a very colloquial way, and he won. And by any measure, he was a very successful president. He had one key theme in his administration, which was inclusion. He created a policy, it goes by a couple different names, Bolsa Familiar, Cesta Básica, which basically says that if you're poor, you will get a guaranteed amount of income and some food supplies every month, provided you do two things. Your kids stay in school and they get all their vaccines. And this was extremely popular. It was also very successful in getting kids to stay in education. And it also allowed him to survive a corruption scandal. See, I'm really going to try to stay to 40 minutes, but I always go off topic. This always happens in my classes. And I have to tell you this one story, because I had been in Brazil in 1992 when the Brazilians impeached their president. And I was there again doing interviews in 2004, and there was another scandal. And I remember I went out of my apartment building one morning. I start walking down the street, and there's all these people coming towards me, and they're waving underwear. They've got underwear on sticks, and they're chanting, and I'm trying to figure out what they're saying. And, you know, my Portuguese was a little rough at the moment. I hadn't been back in Brazil for a while, and it sounded like they were saying, "We want underwear like that." And I thought, well, I'm not understanding this properly. There's some colloquialism, but no, that's really what they were chanting, because a political operative, a bagman for the Workers' Party, had been pulled over, and he'd been found with money stuffed down in his underwear. And I can't remember the exact amount. I think it was over $100,000. And you can imagine trying to talk your way out of that with the policeman. You know, why have you got $100,000 in your underwear? Well, you know, the banks today. And so there was this huge scandal. And I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to be here to see another president impeached. But no, he survived. And he survived because of these policies that really reached out to average people. And he had that ability to kind of connect with people. He was very effective at that. And he was also very strategic in his choices. He came to power at the same time that there was a wave towards the left in Latin America. From Bolivia to Venezuela, you could see one new leader after another coming to power, kind of reflecting a continent-wide dissatisfaction with what was then called the Washington Consensus, a series of policy prescriptions by the United States that were very neoliberal. And so he kind of rides this kind of wave, and he not only finishes out his second term, but he basically handpicks his successor, Dilma Rousseff, who's the current president of Brazil. And she's also very interesting. She is the daughter of a Bulgarian entrepreneur who came to Brazil, for some reason decided to adopt a French name. She was raised in a boarding school by nuns, and then became a Marxist guerrilla in the late 1960s, fighting against the military government. She was a very interesting figure. She was finally arrested in 1970. She was held in prison for a very long time. She was tortured multiple times. She was very sick when she came out of prison. And then she ultimately became involved in politics after democratization. And she winds up being elected president of Brazil. And I can't think of any event that speaks more to the democratic transformation in this country than that. Actually, it was very interesting with the last presidential elections, where at one moment, the two leading candidates were both women, one of whom was a former Marxist guerrilla, one who had grown up in a very large family of rubber tappers in the Amazon. So Dilma has really come into power trying to continue the legacy of Lula da Silva. She has focused on social inequality, but she's also face some pretty intense criticism, I think, and we could talk more about this during the question and answer period, but most people are aware that the World Cup was just held in Brazil. The Olympics are coming up in 2016. There's been a lot of controversy about this. I think the reason the election was so close was because people were so frustrated about both the World Cup and the Olympics. They're building a soccer stadium in Manaus in the heart of the Amazon, which doesn't, I believe, have a professional soccer team. And it's in the Amazon, so the soil is so waterlogged, you have to dig pilings that go down. I can't remember what the figure was. It was like 80 feet or whatever the figure was. It's very large and it's extremely expensive. And people are saying, we want FIFA quality schools. And by FIFA, they're referring to the administrative body that runs international soccer. And so she has responded to this, and she was also doing work. For example, she started the Science Without Borders program, which emerged after Obama visited Brazil in 2010. And allegedly, he told the president, well, why don't we have Brazilian students coming here? And Brazil created this program to send 100,000 students over 4 years to study sciences in the United States. And originally they were supposed to stay a year, but now I believe that they can stay after that. And we have them here. I think there are about 60 people from Brazil here at Portland State as part of this program right now. And I keep running into them. Like I'll be walking across campus and I hear Portuguese in front of me, and I keep interrupting their conversations and speaking Portuguese, which really freaks them out. So I've got to be a little more discreet about doing that. But you know, it's really been something that has attracted international attention and really represents an effort to remake education in Brazil. The other thing they've done is they've adopted an affirmative action program. Because if you looked at many public institutions in Brazil, and it's interesting, in Brazil, the public universities are more prestigious than the private universities. They historically have been very white, so they adopted this affirmative action program, which is very different from the United States. It has quotas. And you also, when you're applying, if I'm a student, I have to submit a picture, and then it goes before a committee that decides, well, is this person black enough to come in under the quota? There was a famous case a few years ago of 2 identical twins who applied, and you know what happened. One of them, the committee said yes. One of them, the committee said no. So you can imagine the headlines. So it's been controversial, but it's also been broadly popular. And it certainly has changed the face of higher education in Brazil. So it's a time when there's a lot of change taking place very, very quickly. And one of the things that Brazil would like to do is to make a number of changes internationally to reflect its increasing influence. Most people probably know, for example, that there's a move towards UN reform. If you look at the members of the UN Security Council right now, they very much reflect the balance of power in 1945, right? For example, why are not Japan and Germany members of the Security Council? And so Brazil has made an argument for reforming the Security Council, and it's part of 4 countries, Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, that have come together to try to reform the Security Council. They're known as the Group of 4. So this is certainly a large priority for Brazil. I think you can also predict what's going to happen. Argentina and Mexico have fought very hard to keep Brazil from becoming a member of the Security Council. They try to do it discreetly, but they feel very strongly about this. And the same thing has happened with every other country that has been proposed. Pakistan, for example, has opposed India becoming a member of the Security Council. This is what the Pakistani UN ambassador said about the Group of 4. Quote, "The seekers of special privileges and power masquerade as the champions of the weak and the disadvantaged." China has opposed the accession of Japan, And Africa has been lobbying to bring Nigeria or South Africa into the Security Council. So this is something that is very important in Brazil. It's something where there hasn't been a lot of movement. You know, nobody's been able to reform the UN Security Council since 1945. So I'm not sure that I'm optimistic that this will take place, but it is something that's very significant to Brazil. And whether or not the Security Council has changed, it is clear that a new power group is emerging globally. They're sometimes referred to as the BRIC group. I'm sure you've heard of that before. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the argument goes that Europe, the United States, Japan are aging powers, that these may be the countries that are going to experience more growth. And this is always sort of a problematic argument. Russia has been in a slow demographic decline for some time that was undermining its national influence even before the price of oil tanked. It's now cheaper than bottled water, which is really amazing. And other countries also have significant problems. China's growth is slowing a little bit. India has had some challenges. But if you look, I would argue that there really is something to this concept of the BRICS. If for no other reason that if you look at the population, the combined population of these four countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, is 2.7 billion people. Now, the global population is just over 7 billion. So you can see that these countries are going to remain essential. And if you look at other factors like sheer geography, absolutely immense amounts of resources remain in these countries. And these countries have been trying to make this idea of the BRICS be more meaningful. What's interesting to me has been watching what's happened since the Edward Snowden revelations of 2013, because it was revealed that the National Security Agency of the United States was tapping the phones of not only Angela Merkel in Germany, but also Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and they are not happy. They are actually right now talking about laying an undersea cable that will go directly from Europe to South America, so that when somebody in Brazil wants to pick up the phone and talk to somebody in Russia, it no longer has to be routed through the United States. And when you see countries coming together to talk about changing the infrastructure of the communication system, you know that you have really annoyed people. So, and they're talking about making other changes. For example, if you look at the World Bank, the voting weight that countries have in the World Bank depends on the amount of money they've given, which sounds fair enough. The United States, of course, has always had the most votes. China, several years ago, asked to be able to give more money so that it could have more voting rights, and the World Bank in the United States said no. So right now there's a conversation going on about creating sort of an alternative to the World Bank. So these things have not come to fruition. And the cynical part of me thinks somebody in the NSA right now is planning a submarine that can go out, find the cable, and tap into it under the water. But the larger point is that there is a commonality of interests amongst these countries that also unites them. And certainly dissatisfaction with the US intelligence services is part of what unites them. Brazil's power, and I don't think I have so much time, so I won't say too much about it, but one of the things that's also been really interesting for me is to watch Brazil's international relations change within Latin America. Because Brazil has very much sought to portray itself as a representative of the global South. Someone, or a country rather, that is fighting to serve the interests of poor countries by doing things like breaking the patents on HIV medications. At the same time, after Argentina had an economic meltdown a little over a decade ago, Brazilian investors went in and bought up large numbers of countries. The national energy company, Petrobras, became a major investor in Bolivia to the point that it really created a lot of national sentiments. And if I remember right, I think Bolivia actually nationalized some Brazilian holdings in that country. And it was kind of interesting. Well, what is Brazil going to do? They were very calm. They were very moderate about it. So at the same time, you see Brazil becoming influential on the world stage and having these conversations with Germany and Russia and India and China. And yet at the same time, sometimes this economic rise comes with costs too, particularly in Latin America. I've got to say a few words about energy policy. Brazil did something really interesting. So you remember the energy crisis and the moment in the 1970s when OPEC kind of turned off the taps for a while and the price of energy or of oil skyrocketed, and we probably, even if you, I have memories of watching the news then as a kid, but even if you weren't, you don't have that memory, you've probably heard about it. And what the Brazilians did was they decided to turn to ethanol. And they designed cars that could run on ethanol, and it's ethanol created using sugarcane. Now, there's a lot of debates about how good it is for the environment to use ethanol instead of gas. For example, there's even an argument that to create a gallon of ethanol in the United States uses more than a gallon of gas. And you know, even the ethanol lobby says, no, that's not true. It's actually 0.9 gallons to create an ethanol, a gallon of ethanol. But however you measure it, it's not really that efficient. It's very different with sugarcane. You know, maybe a gallon of fuel will get you a little over 9 gallons of ethanol. What happened a little over a decade ago was that there was a really bad crop, and the supply of ethanol went way down. And a lot of people were not able to get ethanol for the cars, and they felt a little burned. And what the Brazilians did was they innovated, and they could create cars that could run at the flip of a switch on either ethanol or gasoline. Very different from here. Here you pull up to the fuel pump, right? And it says 10% ethanol. In Brazil, they have cars, and you put in the blend that you want. And this has been very effective in shielding them from oil shocks. They also very recently had the good luck to discover perhaps 55 billion barrels of oil offshore. And you know, this is the kind of oil that 40 years ago nobody would have looked at, because you've got to go out, you go into deep water in the Atlantic, and then you've got to drill 1,000 feet, and you've got to get through a salt layer. It's not easy, right? But it's a very large reserve. And the nice thing is, since a lot of their energy needs are met using ethanol, they can export a lot of it. So this has certainly given them a lot of advantages. When I talk about kind of economic growth, I always touch on energy, but I always have to say something about agriculture as well, because Brazil has become an agriculture powerhouse. And it's happened relatively shortly, basically in the span of a little over 30 years, that they have taken the Cerrado and they have found ways to make this soil productive. And they've put an immense amount of territory in the interior of Brazil into production. And they did this by investing for years and years in new kinds of crops, new kind of agricultural techniques. And so you've seen them become global leaders in areas like soybean production, cattle farming, and other areas. And I have to go off topic and tell you one more story. Whenever I think about the kind of innovation that is taking place in Brazil, I always think about wine. Because when I was in Brazil in 1992, 1993, I was living with these crazy Brazilian students in this rundown apartment. And they loved nothing more than to drink wine and watch soap operas. And I would come home at night and they would be drinking oxblood wine, which came in a wicker basket. It was really big and heavy. You had to kind of roll it over your arm like that. And its claim to fame, on the label, it had a picture of an ox being gored and blood spurting out. And its claim to fame was that it was as thick as blood. It was the thickest. I used to strain it through my teeth. And so I would come home to this apartment after a long day in the archives. I'd open the door. Oh, they're all there. I could hear them. And I'd try to tip down the hall to my room and get in without being seen. And then I always failed, you know. Shawn, you're just in time. Come have some wine. And, you know, and then I'd watch the soap opera with them. And years ago, 2004, I was in Brazil doing some interviews around HIV. And a family friend took me out to dinner at a pizzeria, Rascal's Pizzeria in Sao Paulo. And they were like, oh, let's get some wine. I thought, oh, great, wonderful. And they said, he should really have some Brazilian wine. And my heart just fell. And the wine came on the table, and the cork had eight degrees, you know, 8 in that little circle that means the degree symbol. And I said, well, why does it have that? And they said, well, it's grown up in Pernambuco, really close to the equator. And they always say you can't grow good wine close to the equator. And there they've done it. So they put 8 degrees. And I've actually had Cuban wine, which is a technological achievement. But, you know, the tropics and wine, I thought, they don't go together. And I had this wine. And low expectations going in, granted, but it was wonderful. It was amazing wine. And the reason it was so good is that some Brazilian entrepreneurs had taken some varieties of grapes from southern Portugal, and they had brought them over. And these were grapes from the Algarve in southern Portugal, and they were adapted to this kind of climate. And who would have believed it? You can get a really great wine coming out of Pernambuco, which is amazing. And this is the kind of achievement that the Brazilians keep doing with their agricultural technology. So it's been really impressive to see what's happened there over the last few years. I'm going to move really, really quickly because I have about 20 minutes of material to cover in about 5. But I want to say a couple of things. You know, I just finished teaching a class about Brazil. And one point that I always want to make with that class is that if you were to look at the 2 countries in the Americas that are the most alike, it is Brazil and the United States. Same history of slavery, significant population from the African diaspora, continental size, all kinds of different factors make Brazil and the US similar. And in the reading, which was very well done on Brazil, they talked a little bit about US-Brazilian relations, and this was the only point I wouldn't have quite agreed with the author, because I think that for all the controversies and all the issues that the US and Brazil have, they have a real commonality of interest. So they may fight about Snowden. But in the end, I think that Brazil does a lot of good work for the United States. When there was a crisis in Haiti, the US was stretched thin in Afghanistan and Iraq. Who goes into Haiti? It's the Brazilians, and that is a thankless job. And I think that Brazil has kind of positioned itself sometimes as kind of a mediator between the US on the one side and Chavez and other Venezuelan leaders on the other side, or Bolivia and Ecuador. When things get really bad, I don't know that this happens, but I kind of have this sense that there's this phone call from the White House to Brazil. Can you please do something about Venezuela? And Brazil does step forward in a series of international venues and really does kind of play a mediating role. They have an extremely professional and expert diplomatic service, which has done very well. They also have some soft power, which is sort of interesting to me, but I can certainly see it with my classes. Students take my class on Brazil because they have come to Brazil in all kinds of unexpected ways. And my favorite story is that there was someone in my Brazil class this year who was really interested in art, and this one particular Brazilian artist, I'm blanking on his name, but he has a TED Talk. You know, if you were to go to TED and you were to look for Brazilian artist, and what he's famous for is there are these garbage collectors in Brazil, and they go around with kind of not shopping carts, but big carts, and they pick up trash and they recycle it, and that's how they make a living. And he would go and decorate their carts. And he would paint them all kinds of wild colors, and then there'd be a face, and it always had some statement on it, some little word balloon that had a lot of attitude, like, my living is honest, how about yours, you know? And he had this, the whole project was based off, okay, I don't know much about pop culture, but I think, was it MTV had a series called Pimp My Car? His was Pimp My Garbage Cart. And it was, he took it global. So it started out in Brazil, but it's in India, it's in Argentina and Uruguay, all these different places now. It's sort of a metaphor to me how Brazil has kind of entered into the popular consciousness. You see it with everything from Disney movies to music. I always note that in my Brazil class, there's always one drummer. I can just take that for granted. You know, they're there because they love Brazilian music and they want to learn a little bit about the culture, which is fantastic. I'm always happy to have them there. But I think it's a sense of how Brazil, you know, soft power is a funny kind of term, you know, but it's an example of how Brazil's stock, its image has improved. When I taught about Brazil 15 years ago, what did people think about? They thought about the Terry Gilliam film Brazil, which is wonderful. If you've ever seen it, that scene with Harry Tuttle, the renegade heating engineer, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go rent Brazil. And if you're ever frustrated with bureaucracy, watch that little clip about the man who's decided to go rogue. He can't work within the system. He's going to start repairing things outside, and the police are after him. But 15, 20 years ago, the image of Brazil, people thought of Amazonian destruction. They thought of the murder of street children. They thought of Terry Gilliam's Brazil, right? And now Brazil has been very efficient over the last 5 years at ending deforestation in the Amazon. In fact, now farming globally has more impact on carbon dioxide than deforestation does. They've really been successful with that. Brazil has taken the lead in making sure that people globally have access to free HIV medications. When the HIV drug cocktail was discovered in 1996, it would cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 for a person to obtain this treatment. And so there was a lot of talk at the time that you were going to have 2 HIV epidemics, one in the developed world and one in other poor countries. And in Brazil, the Constitution says that everybody has the right to health care. And so they decided to give free treatment to everybody within reach of a federal medical clinic, which is almost everyone. And to do that, they threatened to break patents. And this led to a huge fight between, on the one side, the US and multinational drug companies, and on the other, Brazil, India, and some NGOs. And Brazil won. They won. And now, in many parts of the world, you can get a year's supply of HIV medications from $300 to $500. It varies a lot from country to country. And the government wound up saving money because it's a lot less expensive to treat people with HIV before they become sick rather than wait for them to get sick and come into an emergency room for end-of-life care. So they actually wound up saving money. And so these kinds of examples, you know, not ending all deforestation, but limiting deforestation in the Amazon, fighting to make HIV medications available, have really, really improved Brazil's standing globally. So this is a very quick overview. I've only had 40 minutes, but what I would say is you can see the change in Brazil when you go there. You don't have to read it in a book or look at economic statistics. There is still immense poverty in Brazil. But it really did strike me on my most recent visit to Brazil a few years ago when I could look out in the harbor and you could see the oil rigs going out, and you could look up at some of the hills and very poor favelas up there, but then others where they've got satellite TV. You could just see it everywhere when you visit it. So, and I hope that if nothing else, maybe I'll inspire a few of you to decide to go there afterwards. So thank you very much. I think I'll end it there.
So speaking of the NSA, by the way, we are live streaming this program, so be on your best behavior. And let's all say all together, the federal government is awesome. So this is the mic for questions. That's the other reason why we have the mic, so your question is on the public record. I don't see a hand going up. Oh, there is, because otherwise I was going to ask a question.
There are books in the back of that they suggest to read. Do you have something that you could tell us that this is what you need to read? This book, this is the book.
Yeah, if there was a single thing that I would suggest you read, it would be Machado de Assis or Clarice Lispector. As soon as I say one, I think of another. But Machado de Assis would be my first recommendation. I'll write that on the board so everybody can see it here. He's probably the most famous Brazilian author. He was the descendant of slaves. He would write these extremely, I'm not trying to think about how to describe them, cynical, very much ahead of their time. They remind me a little bit of Kafka sometimes. Wonderful, wonderful novellas and short stories. And then, I don't know if it's possible to get this up, but I would also say Clarice Lispector. You know, I'm teaching an introduction to Latin American Studies course right now, and I just finished the week on literature a couple of weeks ago, and I had them read a series of Latin American authors, very short stories, and without question the most popular one was Clarice Lispector. One more, I'm just going to keep going for a second. Jorge Amado, he's a really interesting guy. He writes novels that are set in northeastern Brazil. In Portuguese, the J at the front of the word is not pronounced like an H like in Spanish, so it's Jorge Amado, A-M-A-D-O. And his most famous book is probably called, thank you, Gabriela Clove and Cinnamon. And just wonderful stories. It's funny because he's a Marxist, and yet he's got this sense of humor, which is not what you might expect. So, for example, he has this one novel which tells a story about the saint that they bring from Portugal, and they're going to parade around, and then the saint starts dancing in a very inappropriate way. And, you know, there's just a lot of humor in these stories. So Jorge Amado, those would be, I always like to introduce people to a region or to start learning about a region by reading novels or short stories. So that would be what I would start with.
Could you comment on the turmoil in the leadership of Petrobras and the potential political fallout from that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating to me to watch this. So Brazil has had a problem with corruption for a very long time. And there has been an impression, I would say, that they haven't been, that the people have been very tolerant of it. There was a politician in Sao Paulo back in like the early 60s, and I think the informal campaign slogan that he had was, he robs but he gets things done. And when I was in Brazil in 92, 93, and they were impeaching the president, he had a bagman, and the bagman was picked up and arrested and ultimately released. Why? Because he had to go to Europe for emergency snoring. Emergency surgery to cure his snoring. And I have to wonder, how bad was his snoring that he had to be let go for emergency surgery? And actually, I mean, it's funny, but it's also tragic because he came back to Brazil and was murdered. And there was a sense that there's a Brazilian expression, burning the archives, like getting rid of any kind of evidence, right? What I think is different right now is that with the popular protests over the last 2 years that started with the Olympics and the World Cup, but has spread, I don't think there's the same public tolerance. People would get angry before, but they wouldn't turn out in the streets, I would say, in the same way. And one thing, this is a big problem for Dilma. She has, even before this particular crisis with Petrobras, and there are some people saying she's implicated, she has had to replace a number of people in her cabinet for corruption. And that's bad, but the good thing is that there is this change happening where these people are being removed. So I would say overall there's some real progress.
You mentioned Brazil's efforts to make coalition with Asian countries. You don't hear anything about, or is there a possibility of a South American or even Central American coalition building on the nature of the EU, with Brazil taking a leadership role?
Yeah, there is a, Mercosur is a free trade area in Latin America. Brazil is very influential. Venezuela has been trying to create an alternative organization called ALBA. That has been falling apart over the last few years as kind of Venezuela's political and economic influence has declined. I don't think that there's going to be some sort of formal free trade area on the lines of what used to be talked about with the free trade area of the Americas. But what I do think is happening is that, and this is a little controversial, but I would say that China has replaced the United States as the most powerful actor in the region from outside the region itself. So for example, if you look at Nicaragua right now, China, or not the Chinese government, but a Chinese businessman is talking about building a canal. Now, if you think about the 19th century, early 20th century, Stephen Frankel can talk about this a lot more than I can. It's his area of expertise. The symbolism of the construction of the Panama Canal. This was a project that began with the French. The French were not able to finish it. The company collapsed. The United States then adopted it, and you have that, you kind of have that image of Teddy Roosevelt sort of associated with this moment where the U.S. kind of comes onto the global stage by building the Panama Canal. And now you have the idea of a second canal, and it's coming from China. So to kind of get back to your question, I'm not sure that there'll be some sort of formal organization, but I do think that China in particular is very, very influential in the region now.
Can you comment on the last two administrations and how they may have affected the lives of the people in the favelas?
Yeah, I think both Lula and Dilma Rousseff have really had a major impact on the lives of the poor. The number of people living in absolute poverty has really declined. You know that there's a change happening when you can read Veja, which is the national news magazine, kind of like Time here. And there's an article on the fact that it's very hard to get maids now because people just don't have to work anymore. And that's sort of a silly example, but there is this change that's taking place where I think in the reading it said that over the last decade or so, the average income of the people at the bottom of the income pyramid has gone up about 7% a year, whereas at the very top it's been about 1.5%. And Brazil has long been the most unequal country in terms of income in the Americas and the world. And that's changing because of this. I do think that people give much of the credit to Lula and Rousseff when in fact the person who kind of laid the groundwork for this and ended inflation was the previous president, Cardoso. But I think part of the reason for the relative political stability in Brazil, despite some of these scandals like we're seeing with Petrobras right now, has been that for a lot of Brazilians, life has gotten really better.
I'm involved with recovery meetings, and I believe that can help with reducing healthcare cost, and you don't have to pay for therapy, and it's free. So what's your thought in that?
So kind of maybe thinking about Brazil in relation to that and their...
You said something earlier about bringing costs down.
Right. Brazil has, it's interesting. So in the Brazilian constitution, healthcare is a right. And there are a lot of weaknesses in the healthcare system. But the fact that the government makes healthcare available to the people who most need it does sort of draw down costs. And you know, it's remarkable. I was interviewing this crack addict in Sao Paulo about 10 years ago, and they were rebuilding his mouth. And he started talking about this, and he said, yeah, I lost all my teeth basically with crack, so they're putting implants in. And, you know, and I said, well, who pays for that? And he was like, the government does, you know? And the fact that they would be willing to do that, you know, there's nothing really comparable here in the US, does impact the healthcare market. I'm going to go a little, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to go a little off topic. I have one more anecdote I always like to tell, which was that one time I was interviewing people at an NGO that really worked with harm reduction around crack. And this was an organization that worked in the favelas with people who were drug affected. And I had been with them for quite a bit of time during the day before I realized that all the counselors were actually former crack addicts themselves, or were still using it. And so at one point, there was this very well-dressed woman next to me, very quiet, sort of diffident, and she said, well, would you like to see my crack pipe? Well, what do you say? Sure, I'd like to see a crack pipe. And there it was, and she'd hot glued these little jewels on it, and it had a little feather hanging from it. It's a very nice crack pipe. You know, and it really kind of challenged my ideas around drugs. And so Brazil, so kind of coming back to your question, I would say that healthcare is a basic right there in a way that it isn't here. And the fact that they do reach out into the community, that they have Cesta Básica, Bolsa Familiar, HIV medications available for everybody who can reach a federal clinic for free. I don't want to exaggerate it too much. I mean, there are real weaknesses as well for things like treating people who are drug addicted, but it's an amazing achievement when you think about that Brazil has been able to do this. So, yeah.
So my question, or just a statement. In the mid-90s, I attended a women's seminar in Brazil, and it was pertaining to what the government had done to send people out into the favelas to make sure that all girls under 15 were given birth control. Now, the outcome of that, from my understanding, was an awful lot of American doctors at the time did not know that most of these little girls were getting pregnant before they ever got their first period. Now, you've all heard the story that that can't happen, but it is obviously true that these children were played with from very young age, so nobody ever knew how anybody got pregnant. The church was totally against this until they realized these little girls could never get an education unless they were protected till they were 15 so that they could move on. Do you feel from that information that that probably helped the whole situation of healthcare as well as stability economically when you reduce that number of babies having babies?
Brazil is a very paradoxical country. I remember trying to go to the archives once in Brazil, and I was turned away because I was wearing Bermuda shorts. You know, you had to, and it was 42 degrees Celsius, so I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but very, very high. So in some ways, it's a fairly traditional and conservative society. On the other hand, it can be, it's hard to describe an entire nation, but sometimes Brazil can be very pragmatic as well. And including in the area of sexuality. A lot of people, when HIV appeared, really thought that Brazil was going to have a terrible epidemic, and it didn't. And part of the reason that it didn't was that people were able to organize and talk openly about sex in a way that would have been very difficult in other parts of the world. So on the one hand, you have this kind of social conservatism. On the other hand, I can't think of another place where sex workers or prostitutes are unionized. So if you think about Rio de Janeiro, they will go on strike. And you know, they'll be there, the reporters will be out, it's the equivalent of KTU there, like, well, can you tell us a little bit about why you're going on strike right now, you know? So for all the conservatives, it's paradoxical. So I don't know that much about the specific issue, but I would say in general, Brazil has done a pretty good job about addressing some of these issues. But Brazil is also such a big country, it's also hard to generalize. You know, there's this wonderful book. You were asking about what books I could recommend, and one book I might suggest is a book called Waiting for Rain. And it's a book about northeastern Brazil. And it talks about the impact of drought there and kind of looks at drought, not so much historically, but kind of almost from an ethnographic perspective. And for all the advancements they've made, and for all the areas where they sometimes make progress, there are other areas where they have real challenges too. So I'm kind of ducking your question in a way, because it also depends on where in Brazil you talk about.
So we have reached the end of our time together. Let us give Shawn Smallman a big hand.
Thank you.
You know, I also might mention, we hosted a couple of years ago Larry Roeder from the New York Times, who has written a very readable book called Brazil on the Rise, which kind of, I think, you know, it may not drill down into all of the issues, but it gives you a really good overview of the sort of transformation economically, politically, and culturally. So.